All right. Thank you so much for everybody, including Mario Pablo and all the conference organizers. And I want to talk today not only about retro and fantasy, but also the past, present, and the future. So in 2006, I published this book, which I personally thought of as a study of campy revivals of older eras of art and design. And I'm showing you an image here of the 1950s revival rock group Sha Na Na. But to my surprise, it was construed differently, the book. And I was surprised to discover that there were people who thought that it was actually negative, especially its take on futurism. And I think the thing that was getting the most attention was the end of this book, where I described something that I was calling retrofuturism. And here I'm showing you Kenny Scharf's 1980 painting, which is called Ships. It's a rocket like 1950s Cadillac racing through outer space with a ticking clock behind it. I want to probe that tension for a few minutes today because I want to think a little bit further about these questions of futurity, fantasy, and in fact, optimism. So, for a moment, I just want to go over then with all of you three different movements that deal explicitly with these questions of retro, fantasy, design, which is my area. And I'm going to talk about first, just for a moment, popular futurism, then this thing, retrofuturism. And then I want to talk a little bit about steampunk, but specifically, I also want to explore how we can see a deeper discourse emerging in fantasy, nostalgia, and also engagement with our own bodies and forms of making that are emerging today. So, just a few words about this thing that we call the future. And I want to discuss especially popular futurism and ideas about optimism. So, the literary historian I.F. Clarke has discussed what he calls the tale of the future. And he, like many of us, trace back this idea of a kind of insistent secular faith in progress. We often trace it back to the kind of relatively recent optimism that came of age in the 19th century, when humankind, it was believed, could make a kind of continuous change for the gradual betterment of everyone. And this is a progressive model of human development, which is based on the understanding that technological change is good. And it's key to 20th century futurism. Of course, we all know that this kind of progressivism develops in the early 20th century and is reflected in avant-garde art, in the new century, for example, Italian futurism. We also see it in the late 19th and into the early 20th century with feverish writings by people like H.G. Wells. And you even see it in things like penny postcards, and I'm showing you here, this is a cigar box insert published around 1900, depicting a French vision of the year 2000. And in it, you have a world of flying cars and flying policemen. Arguably, this kind of thinking reached its apogee, its height, with the kind of technological ebullience of New York's 1939-1940 World's Fair, when its futurist theme, and that whole fair was called Building the World of Tomorrow. The whole theme came to a head, showing the movement's kind of coming of age. Probably the most popular display at that fair was, in fact, Norman Bell Getty's Futurama. And it was partly what made the fair such a popular success. So I'm showing you here an image showing crowds snaking around the entrance of the building, which was sponsored by General Motors. So in Retro, the book that I published, I describe how this form of futurism runs into something larger, however, in by the 1960s. And on the surface of it, the 1969 moonwalk might seem to highlight those kind of futurist ambitions. But over the next decade, there was this mounting skepticism which began to take over and envelop technology and futurism alike. And this is partly coming to a head because of fears of pollution, of environmental disasters that included in the US, Love Canal, 3 Mile Island. And indeed, there was also a deep questioning of mass chemical warfare like the napalm bombings in Vietnam, as well as concern about resources and reflected in the, for example, the oil embargo of the early 1970s. There's also this whole economic malaise that sets in at that time. So you start to get these really provocative kinds of discussions around technology and its benefits. And also, honestly, a lot of those glamorous, optimistic visions of the future, which were filled with jetpacks and meals in a pill, like this. This is some image from the 1950s showing literally food, supposedly, that you could eat in a meal in a single couple of pills. People began to question this as an unsustainable promise. Moreover, many observers began to question the benefits of scientific innovation and started to wonder about the ecological and social toll that it actually exacted. So by the late 1970s into the early 1980s, we were starting to evolve different views of science and progress. Even by 1979, a scholarly symposium, and it was called Technology and Pessimism, by the New York Times. And it was described by their writer there as delving into this mood of pessimism, and which was seen as overtaking these older optimistic ideas. Now, something else, though, and this is where maybe I start to take issue with the critiques of that book that I had written, Retro. Something else was starting to take popular futurism's place. So we've just been talking about popular futurism, and you see it on the pages of kind of popular science and mechanic sorts of hobbyist journals like Modern Mechanics. What was taking its place, I argue, is what I was calling this term that was kind of around at the time anyhow, retrofuturism. And just for a quick moment, I want to turn from popular futurism into the late 20th century's rise of this thing, retrofuturism. And for me, it was building on the futurists' kind of fevered visions of space colonies and flying cars. But while futurists took the promise of progress for granted, the retrofuturists were more skeptical. And here with the Kenny Scharf image that I showed you earlier of the Cadillac, there's something, I would argue, kind of half nostalgic, half sentimental in memorializing of popular futurism. So he's looking back over 20 years to that image of the Cadillac, of the kind of car that was dominant 20 years earlier in the 1950s. And in it, you can see the Cadillac whizzing through the space, the ticking clock, and it's clearly left the American road behind. It just seems to be whizzing headlong into the realm of nostalgia, as if it has a date with destiny of some sort. On the face of it, retrofuturism is different from popular futurism. It alludes to what could be called yesterday's tomorrows, but it also does contain a tinge of sadness. In contrast with futurism's kind of visionary optimism, retrofuturism is typically dismissive of futurist dreaming, which it looks back on over the space of about 50 years. And I'm just showing you here the cover for a exhibition, Yesterday's Tomorrows, that was held by the U.S. Smithsonian Museum. And it embodies this shift. If we were to walk into that exhibition, what you would have seen were these kinds of models of flying cars. Buckminster Fuller, the futurist imaginary that he had, for example, of his Dymaxion house, which is a metal house that we were all thought to live in, developed in 1927. It had Buck Rogers ray guns and illustrations from magazines like Popular Science. It also included postcards like this. And they expressed those kind of idealized expectations for the future that shaped them. So, contemporary with the Smithsonian exhibition, popular culture embraced a similar sort of sensibility, and that's what we're seeing in the Kenny Scharf painting. He's taking up this theme. But it wasn't just in that way. In popular culture, there were even this kind of quirky electronic music of groups like Kraftwerk, and there's a kind of quasi-futurist sensibility about it. Hollywood launched a series of films similarly, and you can think of the wildly dystopian worlds presented in 1980s science fiction films like Blade Runner, for example. So here we come to what I would say is the problem of retro, right? And it's seen as being pessimistic only, yesterday's tomorrows. And that is actually a rather difficult concept in some ways. Yesterday's tomorrows, then, is something that has been taken to be something negative. And here in a 2005 essay, I point to the writing by a German architectural critic, and the essay is called Goodbye to Retrofuturism. And for him, retrofuturism appears to be, he says, nothing more than an aesthetic feedback loop, recalling a lost belief in progress. So the sense is that there's nothing new or productive going on here, really. Indeed, we could cast this development as just a simple tale of the kind of popular flowering of futurism, and then its subversion with retrofuturism. And this is where I ended my book, to be sure. But I would say that we might be able to go on now and engage some newer forms, for example, steampunk, which developed after, or at least it was in developing when I wrote that book. But it has kind of filtered out into popular culture in some interesting ways and has some themes in it that I think are worth looking a little bit more deeply at. Ideas with futurity, making, and also the body. At first glance, steampunk, and I'm sure I hardly need tell this audience, the kind of costumes in it seemed like an extended dress-up game, a party, and with the kind of eclectic smattering of goggles and corsets fitted with brass buckles and brocade waistcoats. And they're all worn, as we all know, with varying degrees of seriousness. But I would say that its more defining characteristics can sometimes be elusive. Of course, it does draw from the stage of steam, that is the first industrial revolution, as it took shape in the mid-19th century. And all the while, it also incorporates a kind of rebelliousness and do-it-yourself aesthetic of the punk movement too. But instead, though, of punk, it's actually embracing now things like archaic cogs and gears and flywheels of obsolete steam power technologies. However, its practice is constructed. Steampunk claims to look to the first steam industrial revolution, a moment when technology and applied science were more knowable and more personal. Steampunk novels, and I'm sure you all already are aware of this, really revolve around flapping dirigibles, clockwork devices, and everything seems to kind of hiss and chug, and a lot of the mechanics move the narratives along. The older technologies are lovingly described, but beyond that, there has been a whole steampunk subculture. And so coming out of literature and graphic novels, embracing in its own way music, and here I'm showing you a musical group, theater and stage performance, interior design, and clothing to be sure. And here I'm just showing you a commercial sewing company, Simplicity and Sewing Patterns for competent sewers to make steampunk clothes. But there's also this engagement with technology itself, which is important. Steampunk is also doing something kind of different here. So it has this kind of, yes, optimism that aims to blend the digital technologies of now and also the kind of hacking culture of the handmade. So here I'm showing you, of course, a USB thumb drive, and it's been embellished with wood and brass. And the author Cory Doctorow is describes steampunk as a subculture in which makers can produce wonderments that simultaneously embody light speed, technological change, and enduring artisanship. And all we have to do is think about, for example, the computers that have been customized, laptop computers that are stuffed into mahogany casings and mounted on clawed feet, attached with brass keyboards and turn on with something like a clock winding key with steam gauges that seem to register battery power. Now, I want to go back to that question of futurity and pessimism. And I also want to reflect, maybe now with some 20 odd years of working on these questions in the field. My most recent scholarship personally has been focusing on disability and design. And I have most recently been working on the history of the universal access symbol. But this has resonance for me as a disabled person, but it also makes me think about this whole disability culture today and changing ideas of bodies and bodily enablement. And to be sure, really does engage questions of making and embodies this kind of robust, indeed, we could say, optimistic sense of agency. But I'm also intrigued with something a little bit deeper, and you could say it's a deeper level of optimism here too, namely its reflection of fantasy, disability, and prosthetics. Indeed, once we're attuned to it, steampunk is filled with prosthetic limbs, with goggles that are implying enhanced vision, hearing aids made of cogs, and a near constant reference to bodily enhancement by machines. And so I'm especially intrigued in steampunk's culture of disability, which not only eschews invisibility, but celebrates the accommodations, the prosthetics with impairment associated with impairment, mobility, seeing, hearing. Again, what seems most curious to me is that these prosthetic and other assistive devices are, in fact, actually non functional very often in the subculture out there. They're really meant to be mainly decoratives, that is, in the kind of acting up, the sort of dress up that a lot of people have engaged in. So this is interesting to me. In my recent research, it's quite clear that prosthetics and wheelchairs are really fraught and have been in our culture for a long time. In fact, throughout most of history, disability was something to be hidden. And I'm just showing you here images of the American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and a rare photograph of him in a wheelchair, usually. And as you see on the left, he went to great lengths to make himself seem as if he was able-bodied enough to walk. The wheelchair was hidden from the public view. And indeed, if we were to think about the history of the prosthesis, it was this kind of surreal sorts of metal legs that were given to these soldiers after World War I were considered temporary, and in general, prostheses were really made to look as much like the human body as possible. So here I'm showing you a realistic human looking hand that's been attached to a more mechanical looking prosthesis, which this man is wearing. But the idea is that he would wear clothes over the mechanical part, and you'd only see the flesh-like hand normally. So with the prosthesis, they were really, at that point, made to look, as they became more sophisticated, to look more and more natural. The curious thing in steampunk fantasy, however, is that the prosthesis is really celebrated, not hidden. The wheelchair belching steam or the heavily carved metal leg, these things here really cry out for attention. Several reasons come to mind for why this might be happening. First of all, you could talk about the militarization of prosthetics that's increased in recent years. And even non disabled people can have the capabilities to enhance their vision, for example, with night vision eyewear. Also, steampunk goggles and especially prosthetic arms and legs can suggest superhuman powers and bionic augmentation. We have, of course, a culture in which athletes use artificial limbs to enhance their performance, melding human and machine for optimal achievement. And I just am citing here images from the Paralympics. In this case, representations of disability have no sense of frailty at all, but instead you have this sense of overcoming and becoming even more than human, right? But I also just want to point your attention to maybe something that is a little bit less clear. Over the last few decades, we also have had a very newly assertive stance towards disability based on something that's called the social model. And in fact, this culture of disability in it. Impairment is not just accommodated by doctors, but it's addressed as a social concern. And disabled people's autonomy and individuality, in this case, are often celebrated. To be sure, I find it fascinating that steampunk makers are not hiding impairment, but rather celebrating it. In fact, many are not even disabled themselves. But the kind of culture around steampunk also echoes in a curious way, for me at least, a kind of parallel culture that's going on in a do it yourself culture that's going on amongst disabled people. Indeed, I see these fake prostheses. They remind me of recent efforts by disabled people to design, for example, their own prosthetics. And you can see this over and over with various kinds of CAD programs, printed prototypes that are rapidly produced and so forth. And these can deliver all sorts of capabilities. As you can probably tell, I've moved beyond here, all these sorts of questions about design and disability, which have haunted our cumulative imaginations. But I'm also tying this into retro and to go back to that question of negativism. But I suspect something different is emerging too, to go back to the ideas of the past, the present, and the future, and especially futurism and retrofuturism, it's interesting to return to the body and the machine as these kinds of common themes. Indeed, 20th century futurism has often given us this interesting kind of celebration of technology and augmented human powers. But what's fascinating to me is this recent celebration of performance enhancing prosthetics, which have been developed for disabled people, or at least in our fantasy worlds have, and continue to have a kind of futurist sensibility around them. As I'm say, in this kind of representation of disability, there's no hint of human frailty. Instead, mind, body, technology seem to be ushering in some kind of promised new world. And we have in this a kind of triumphant kind of post-human age, of course. And my guess is that steampunk enthusiasts have picked up on this. Of course, the reality of disability and design today is a lot less exciting visually, and it doesn't fit our ideas of futurism per se. But for me, at least, this is a fascinating direction for our fantasies of the human body. And yes, it does suggest a kind of, I would say, optimistic turn for our visions of fantasy for the future to come. Thank you.